Welcome to the Breakpoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris, host of the Upstream podcast and one of the writers for Breakpoint. I'm joined today by John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center and the voice of Breakpoint. Today we're answering your questions. These were sparked by Breakpoint commentaries, short courses, and the Colson Fellows program. If you'd like to send us a question to answer here on the show, please send us an email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John, let's jump right into questions today because we've got a lot of interesting ones. The first one's from someone who writes in, you've spoken about a theology of getting fired. My question is, how does the doctrine of the lesser magistrate or the doctrine of interposition fit into this for public officials? So those are two at least 50-cent words, maybe $1 each, John. The first one, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, is something that comes out of the Reformation. And it's the idea, and I think it was out of the Reformation. There may be some important precedents in medieval history as well. But the idea, as the Reformers understood it, was that a magistrate at a lower level who believes that his higher level magistrate, so say a lord or an elector to a king or an emperor, can disobey an unjust order by the higher magistrate in the service of the higher law of God, and that the person under that magistrate whom he or she is protecting can still be in obedience to the biblical command in Romans, for instance, to be subject to the governing authorities. Interposition, as I understand it, is a really similar concept, and it's also similar to the idea of nullification, where a state can reject an edict from the federal government in certain circumstances in a morally defensible way if that edict is unjust. So, for example, if a state had said, you know what, we're not going to obey the fugitive slave law. We're not going to send fugitive slaves who come to our borders back to the South to be put back in chains because that's unjust. That would have been an exercise of this idea of interposition.
Yeah, I mean, great questions, and I think they all play into this at some level. But of course, finding a biblical justification or a legal justification for civil disobedience doesn't guarantee that you're going to get off the hook. And I think that's the bigger question of the theology of getting fired is, when are we actually willing to say, you know, all right, I've got to make this choice. These two things weren't mutually exclusive options, my career and my convictions, until now. Now they are. And I might be able to justify myself, and these doctrines probably help me think through it a little bit more, and hopefully in a better sort of way, because for example, in a Christian worldview, every magistrate would be a lesser magistrate, because as Martin Luther King Jr. and others have said, a law that does not align itself with the law of God is no law at all. So you have an actual responsibility to disobey that law. Of course, the challenge with that is you might not be justified for defending that law on this side of the beheading. That's the that's the realism that I'm hoping that we are able to get to. I do think, though, the doctrine of interposition is something that needs to be resurrected more and more and more. And I think as the states so dramatically split on how they see so many different issues, you're going to see this become, more significant. You've had, for example, under President Trump, California just decide, we're going to do whatever we want. And that's just going to continue. And so, as a state level lawmaker, this is actually something that maybe should be considered, and on something like abortion. And I think that's, for example, what Mississippi is trying to do in this lawsuit. So I think these are all helpful ways to think about it. I would love to hear book suggestions, because I'm sure people are hearing some of these words for the first time. So I don't know if you have any book suggestions, but if you do, now's the time, Shane. Let people know.
I don't have any book suggestions that immediately come to mind on these ideas specifically, but more broadly, the idea of remaining subject to the governing authorities while at the same time doing what you believe in your conscience is right. It's something that, again, goes back to the Reformation and the desire that many of these Christian pastors and teachers and theologians had to not to be rebels, not to be anarchists, not to disobey Paul's instructions, but to continue to exhibit their belief that the governing authorities were agents appointed by God for the good of his people and to administer justice. And that it doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it does mean that to the best of your ability, you should you should intend and attempt to remain under their authority. It's that recognition of authority is something you see in the Gospels too. With Jesus seems to be especially impressed with the centurion who says, I realize that you can heal my servant because all you have to do is give the word, because I'm a man under authority. I know what it means to be under authority and to say to one servant, go, and he goes, and do this, and it gets done. Now, the thing that I'm curious about and that I'm not quite decided on, and I'd like to do some more reading myself, is the question of, what do you do, or what does it look like to be obedient when there is no lesser magistrate, when there's just no option? Because that's sort of your go-to alternative to obeying a higher magistrate who is in error. But if you are really in a situation like I guess many of the civil rights crusaders were, like Martin Luther King Jr. was in, where all the magistrates are essentially arrayed against you on key issues, what do you do? And the argument there was that you have to follow the highest authority of all, which is God. Now, that's a very, very grave position to find yourself in, because when you do that, you are taking the mediating position of the magistrate out of the picture and answering directly to God. And when you do that, what you do at that point, you will answer directly to God for that. And so if you've done a good job and upheld what's right, then you'll have great reward for that. But at the same time, it's something that I think these doctrines exist to remind us we ought to be very, very careful before stepping into those positions. And that's what it seems to me, that's what's happening, like you said, in a lot of these cases with laws that are deliberately enacted in many cases to challenge existing rulings and federal laws, and to provoke court disputes that will ultimately have the potential to change the law for everyone.
Yeah. And it's important to note, too, I just saw, just to be clear, that it was a question for public officials. And I think in this particular moment, we're in a dizzy moment. The moment is dizzy for elected officials because it goes back and forth so dramatically. So much lawmaking has been done by executive fiat that rules change, departments change. And so the question is do you use that strategy when you're in power, and what does it look like to unravel unjust laws or unjust policies from a previous administration and put new ones in place in such a way that they're not so easily overcome, they're not so easily just reversed. And so really knowing kind of how the whole process works and a biblical role of what it means to govern, I think is crucial in knowing. And so it's an interesting conversation. And I just remembered the book that someone had sent me, where they've done kind of a whole work on this, and in fact, I kind of wonder if this is the actual person who sent in the question. Maybe it's a sneaky way to promote his own book. But a man named Matthew Trewhella, The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates, a proper resistance to tyranny and a repudiation of unlimited obedience to civil government. It is notable how, and I can't vouch for the book. I haven't read it deeply. I've skimmed through it, but at the same time, it is notable that we're having this conversation more and more. One of the last videos that Chuck Colson did on the YouTube channel that he started was having to do with civil disobedience. And when is that the case, and what will that look like? And then what does that look like for public officials? That's all, a very important question.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to outline a really quick and obvious example, if you're a public official who has been instructed to participate in the coercion of parents in order to transition a minor, their child, according to medical advice, from male to female or female to male or something like that, then you would have, I think, an obligation before God to either quit or sit there and resist and refuse to carry it out. You must not carry it out. It's the one thing you can't do. And if you can get a higher official on your side, I mean, if you could get the governor of your state to interpose on your behalf, then you've got a much better situation there than if you're just a lone actor standing up and like we said, you could be fired pretty quickly. The second question here is a fascinating one about priorities. This person writes in, "Thank you for your thoughtful insights. I'm so grateful for your courage in addressing issues that are oftentimes ignored. Y'all are such an encouragement to our family." So thank you for that. My question today regards tithing to the local church body. Jesus is very clear that we are to be extremely generous with the provisions he has entrusted us with. The New Testament seems to say that the idea of a 10% tithe is a minimum and we should give sacrificially. However, I see so many needs throughout the world, from basic necessities such as food and medication, to support for the persecuted church, to rescuing those enslaved in various forms of trafficking. How can I justify giving 10% of my gross income to essentially serving myself through a local church body when there is so much hurt and need throughout the world?
Yeah, I think that the 10% number, a lot of people come to different conclusions on whether that 10% number is a mandate, it is a number, it is a minimum, and what's meant by that. I think treating it as a minimum is probably a pretty good idea. It's also interesting that it's based on kind of Old Testament ideas of tithes, which has a lot more to do, a lot less to do with money than basically every part of your life. And so this idea of living a generous lifestyle, which is why I'm a big fan of the organization called Generous Giving, and they do gatherings called Celebrations of Generosity and Tastes of Generosity. Taste of Generosity. These are just ways to teach through what it means to kind of embrace that lifestyle of giving, and I do think that. One of the challenges of living in a communication age is that the needs from around the world are upfront and personal, and it can give us the illusion that we can do something about it, even if we can't. And I think that's one of the things to be wise about. It's easy to think about the rest of the world and not think about your own backyard. It's easy to throw money at a problem when money is actually not the real problem of the problem, if that makes sense. It would be easy if the real problem undergirding all of these issues around the world were a lack of finances, because then you could just deliver the finances and that would be that. We have seen for the last 30 years in which global abject poverty around the globe, starvation level poverty around the globe, has been cut in more than half just in the last 3 decades, that the answer to the problem wasn't more money, which means that the problem that needed to be solved wasn't lack of money. The problem that needed to be solved at times had to do with legal rights being recognized and acknowledged. It had to do with opportunities being provided. It had to do with access to resources and capital and wisdom. In some places, it had to do with a shifting worldview from, for example, in certain communities around the world, chalking up, the fate of your crops to the gods or the ancestors, to actually bringing in technology engineering or something like that and being able to overcome whatever curse the land was facing because you could irrigate. This is what Ron Nash in the opening line of his book calls, so he puts it this way. He says, we have to help the poor with our head, not just with our heart. And with our heart, we will tend to throw money at the problem. And that's not always what we need, which goes back to our concept of generosity. And that is that there is a goodness and a beauty to becoming really good at whatever God's called you to be good at, whether it's art or understanding justice or building systems of care for certain communities, or being good at parenting or grandparenting. And how can we be generous with those things? Because by and large, a source of suffering, you take, for example, the American poverty problem, and many people have talked and written about this at various levels. You fix fathering in America, and you all but eliminate poverty. It's almost that clear. I'm not saying that there's nothing else. Obviously, there's various levels of symptoms, from mental illnesses to whatever else. But I'm thinking of Graham. He runs an incredible ministry in Austin, Texas, using tiny homes to return dignity and homes to homeless populations. And the success rate of getting people back on their feet there is just crazy good. And you'd think, well, the answer is he gives the homeless homes, tiny homes.
Alan Graham, tiny homes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've done some content on him in the past. What he'll say, and I think we quoted in that breakpoint, we can maybe link to it, Shane, is that homelessness is not caused by a lack of home or a lack of money. Homelessness is what does he call it? A catastrophic loss of relationship. And if you think about throwing money at someone who is an addict, you're not going to help the problem. You're going to make the problem worse. But if the real problem is a catastrophic loss of relationship, and you can start putting people back into a context to relearn relational skills, being responsible, being lovable, to other people, and vulnerable, all of that sort of thing can actually solve the problem. And so I know it's easy to look around and see so many needs. It's almost easier to throw money at it than it is to be generous with all the other things that God has given us, our expertise, our knowledge, our relationships, our systems, our access to justice, that sort of thing. I'll end with this illustration. We all know the parable, right? Or the proverb, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for the rest of his life. That's only true if a man has a fishing pole and he lives near water, and that water is not polluted, and the local government official doesn't take his fish or half of his fish or 3/4 of his fish the moment he catches them. And in other words, learning the skill is important, but having those relational, healthy structures that contextualize it, relationship with creation, a relationship with authorities, relationship with neighbor, then all of a sudden, learning to fish has a far bigger return on investment than just having the knowledge.
Don't we also have to ask, because of the part of this question where we're talking about how much money goes to the church, right? And whether the church is just kind of a secondary means of serving ourselves. Don't we also have to ask what the purpose of the church is? Because obviously caring for neighbors, loving the poor, and addressing the brokenness in our world is part of it. But it seems to me there's something we're missing if we're only thinking of church, the church, in terms of ROI for poverty, right? That's not the sole or even the primary purpose of the church. In the understanding that we get from Scripture, and certainly in my understanding, but I think it's evidenced very clearly in the Gospels, there is this sense that God is our first priority, and that worshiping Him is not an add-on or an extra. Corporate worship of God with the people of God through word and sacrament, song. This is not. It's not secondary. We see the story of, most dramatically, the story of the woman coming in and anointing Jesus with this expensive perfume and drying his feet with her hair. And Judas is the one who speaks up, and he goes, "Wow, this was expensive. This could have been this could have been sold and the money given to the poor." And he seemed to have that kind of poor first or charity first mindset, or at least John gives us a little peek behind the mask, where he says that Judas said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was greedy. But nevertheless, the excuse that he gives doesn't stand, because Jesus says, "The poor you'll have with you always, but I'm only with you for a little while. What she's done is beautiful, and she'll be remembered for it." And so that attention given first and foremost to God is a good thing. Now we can use that as an excuse, like the Pharisees did, and to say, "Well, I'm not going to give this money to my parents and take care of them because it's dedicated, right? It's sacred inheritance." But I guess it comes down to the spirit of what you're doing, to the heart. A true and pious belief and practice is never going to neglect those in need. Christianity has always been marked by unique and insistent generosity toward those who offer nothing in return. But at the same time, our key and primary priority is really the worship of the one true God, and glorifying Him with our time and our treasure. Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks so much for listening to the Breakpoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. If you've got a question and you'd like to hear us take a stab at it here on the program, you can email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next week.